High-level officials from China and the United States meet in Beijing to discuss a number of economic and geopolitical issues. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. It was 2009 when Chinese President Hu Jintao and U.S. President Barack Obama established what has now become an annual high-level strategic and economic dialogue between China and the United States. Known as S&ED, this year's meeting, held in Beijing, comes at a time of tension over such issues as the South China Sea, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and economic uncertainty. Later, we'll talk with several scholars about what was accomplished during this, the 8th meeting between the two countries. But we begin in Beijing with CCTV's Han Peng. And Han, tell us who was there and what did they talk about?
And then this year's high-level talks were co-chaired by Chinese Vice Premier Wang Yang and State Councilor Yang Jiechi, as well as U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Treasury Secretary Jack Lew. High on their agenda was teeing up a meeting between President Xi and Obama later this year at the G20 summit in Hangzhou. On strategic matters, the South China Sea remained one of the biggest areas of disagreement. Another concern, China's new law on tightening restrictions on non-governmental organizations and charity groups. More than 7,000 foreign NGOs are operating in China. Under the new law, they have to submit to police supervision and declare the sources of funding. Secretary Kerry raised concerns about this. Beijing says the new law only aims to improve the playing field for civil society. Despite their differences, both sides also emphasize their common grounds. Examples include nuclear issues with Iran and the Korean Peninsula and the historic Paris Agreement on climate change. On global economy, China's overcapacity in steel production was a hot issue. U.S. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew said China's overcapacity is having a negative global impact. China denies its producers have been dumping excess steel in the U.S. market, where steel prices have tumbled close to 40% recently. But Finance Minister Lou Jiwei addressed his counterpart's concern, saying that China will do what it can to rein in output, but China is also struggling to restructure relevant industries. He also said that China is no longer a planned economy and that the government can't give a direct order to private companies to curtail overcapacity overnight. The two sides made progress on bilateral investment treaty. Senior officials agreed to speed up negotiations. Anand.
According to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, the United States raised issues about the South China Sea. What was China's response to that?
Exactly. Kerry raised the issue on the very first day of the dialogue, but this time he appeared to soften his tone, despite the U.S. Defense Secretary's tough words at the Shangri-La dialogue last Friday. Kerry said the U.S. is looking for a peaceful resolution and will not support any of the competing claims for the South China Sea islands. His remarks were cautiously welcomed by Beijing. Chinese State Councilor Yang Jiechi says China hopes that the United States will honor its pledge not to take sides. He also reaffirmed China's stance on the issue, saying China's activities in the South China Sea are justified because it has indisputable sovereignty over the islands there. He stressed once again that China will not interfere with the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea or with overflights. Back to you, Anand.
Thanks, Peng. That's CCTV's Han Peng reporting from Beijing. Joining us from New York to talk about all this is Robert Hormat. He's a former U.S. Under-Secretary of State and is currently Vice Chairman of Kissinger Associates. That's a global consulting firm. With us here in Washington is Sun Yun, Associate with the East Asia Program at the Stimson Center, an independent public policy institute. And joining us from Beijing is Yi Hailin. He's a Senior Research Fellow at the National Institute of International Strategy. That's part of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Yi Hailin, as we just heard, the South China Sea was raised by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry during the meeting in Beijing. Let's listen to what the Secretary had to say about that.
We are looking for a peaceful to the disputes of the South China Sea. We are not a claimant. We have taken no position on any of the claims of any claimant. The only position we've taken is, let's not resolve this by unilateral action. Let's resolve this through rule of law.
So, Yi Hailin, is this a softening of the U.S. position concerning the South China Sea?
Yes, compared with the statements the State Secretary made a couple of weeks ago, we can say it's a kind of the soften, but I don't think the State Secretary changed his policy and attitude towards the South China Sea dispute fundamentally, or have some really mean some dramatic change. It still remain the policy as the American always do. And the State Secretary state that the supposed peaceful peaceful settlement, but actually now Americans are enhancing the military presence in the South China Sea, and also so-called the unilateral action. Actually, we can say it's not only China take the unilateral steps, but America and his alliance, including Philippines, also they do something natural. So it's not only for one side. If we want to make the peaceful agreements, I think the go to the negotiation table has the multiple bilateral contacts more important. But now, currently, we don't think we don't see America already make the effort to persuade his alliance, such as the Philippines, to launch the negotiation with China.
The United States may be adopting a softer tone when it comes to the issue of the South China Sea, but what are we to make of that? Since October, the United States has conducted what it called naval operations in this particular part of the South China Sea.
From the United States perspective, of course, the sovereignty U.S. doesn't have a position on. And for the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, U.S. doesn't have a position on that either. But U.S. does have a position about the freedom of navigation in the international waters. And we know that South China Sea is a very important portion of the international waters, not only for trade purpose, but also for the U.S. military passage in that region. So from the U.S. perspective, the freedom of navigation is more of a matter of principle. And the peaceful solution, of course, is another principle.
Robert, of course, the two sides have been talking about economic issues, about trade issues. They've been discussing a bilateral investment treaty. The U.S. says that it welcomes Chinese investment. But is there a risk here that this dispute over the South China Sea could undermine the economic benefits in the relationship between these two countries?
I think that so far the history of the relationship over the course of several decades has been that there are geopolitical issues and there are economic issues. And by and large, the economic issues have been kept separate from the geopolitical issues. The strong relationship between the United States and China on economic policy has continued to be a prominent feature in the overall relationship and basically has been isolated from and insulated from other issues that tend to arise from time to time between the two, because both sides have a keen interest in closer trade ties and closer investment ties, and Chinese investment in the United States creates jobs. American investment in China creates jobs. It's in the common interest to continue that process.
Yi Hailin, China and the United States have both committed themselves to implementing confidence-building measures, as they put it, when it comes to the South China Sea. They talk about implementing new rules, and they call it the rules of behavior for safety and maritime encounters. What specifically needs to be done here?
I think that's quite important to show that both sides has the confidence and has the determined to solve the problem peacefully, and you avoid the potential military conflicts. But meanwhile, we also need to point out the measure of the confidence building and also the rules on the behaviors only can prevent the accident, but they can't avoid some intentionally conflicts. So such as to show the muscle in the certain areas and the response by another side then cause some potential conflicts. It's such kind of the conflicts. If the design and has some political decision made by the headquarters of each side, it's very difficult to be avoided by the rules on the interaction or something like this.
Yuan, there were other geopolitical strategic issues that were discussed at this round of the strategic dialogue. There were issues about cybersecurity, Hong Kong's status, the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and efforts by both China and the United States to counter Islamic terrorism. Was there any progress made on these issues?
Well, these issues have been long-standing issues in bilateral relations, and especially on the issue of North Korea, we know that North Korea had a nuclear test again this past January. So for China to implement the UN sanction resolution is very high on the agenda for the U.S. administration. And these four issues that you just mentioned, they were all discussed. As for substantive progress on the cooperation, we will just have to see.
Okay, Robert, let's talk economic issues in the meetings between these two countries. What were the main economic issues?
Well, I think basically they are trying to move ahead on the bilateral investment treaty. That's certainly a major thing, but the United States, as you know, has asked for China to reduce the number of categories that are on the restricted list, and to open up more opportunities. The negative list issue and the number of categories on it are perhaps the most significant part of that overall relationship. China, of course, is interested in where the TPP stands. The TPP has been negotiated, as you know. The question is, in the United States, will it be ratified by the Congress? It's a very controversial point in domestic politics. China has an interest in that. The U.S. has certainly an interest in what China is doing with the RCEP, China's trade negotiations with ASEAN and many of ASEAN's partners. That's an issue. Not so much that there are differences of opinion, but I think each country is giving the other a status report on where these things stand.
Okay, Yi Hailin, there was a recently published article written by the former deputy Chinese foreign minister Fu Ying, described Chinese-U.S. relations as neither allies nor enemies. She said both sides seem to be reassessing each other's intentions on a strategic level. So how would you characterize the relationship right now between these two countries?
Yes, I agree Mrs. Fu Ying's assessment is neither enemy or no alliance. But I think when we talk about the bilateral relationship on the international perspective, usually we will say it's cooperation, coordination, competition, and confrontation. And these are 4C categories, different categories. But in my understanding now, in the economy issue, we can see more the coordination and even cooperation. But for the security issue, I think the confrontation now is getting more strong. Released a lot of such kind of information to show probably China and the U.S. in military perspective have some confront or conflicts. So it's not a always very pessimistic understanding on the bilateral relation. I hope China and the U.S. can work together to control the dispute and different understanding on the certain geopolitical issue, but especially on the South China Sea.
And on that issue, President Xi Jinping has called for deepening communication and cooperation in Asia-Pacific affairs between China and the United States. What will it take for these two sides to achieve that goal?
Well, I agree with what Professor Ye just said, but it takes two to dance. For the United States and China, we both know, both countries understand that the essential problem between the two countries is a competition for influence, and it's a geopolitical issue, that whether the rising China should be allowed its own sphere of influence in the West Pacific, and how U.S. should accommodate China's intention and China's assertiveness. So all the issues in Asia-Pacific basically boil down to that one single issue of the nature of U.S.-China relations. China demands more influence. China demands a bigger sphere of influence. And the U.S. is willing to accommodate, but on the other hand, there's also a reluctance on the U.S. side about how China behaves or how China's behaviors should be modified according to the international law or the international rules. So these are basically the issues of the bilateral relations. We hope that S&ED could provide more ad-hoc supervision for the management of these essential geopolitical issues. But it's also disappointing to see that S&ED now is more of a working level dialogue rather than providing the strategic guidance to the direction. Both countries say that we need cooperation, we need more dialogue, and we need coordination to deal with these challenges in Asia-Pacific. But the reasons that we're not seeing that happening is precisely because of this geopolitical calculation.
Robert, the strategic and economic dialogue, of course, is an important forum for these two countries, but there has been criticism of the process itself. The South China Morning Post newspaper says the economic dialogue is beset by too many bureaucrats with too little power, and there's a loss of focus. The newspaper says China and the U.S. need to overhaul their annual strategic meeting to make it more effective. Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree. I was part of this for 4 years. I participated very actively. I think it has moved away from strategic conversations, strategic on geopolitical issues, strategic on economic issues, and gotten, particularly on the economic side, into details where lots of issues are raised. There are bureaucrats from virtually every agency on the American side, and I assume also on the Chinese side. And there's a lot of sort of a checklist. I raise this, you raise this, I raise this, you raise this. But we've moved away from a strategic conversation. I think we need to go back to that. I was actually working with Dr. Kissinger when we first started the opening with China, and I remember Premier Zhou Enlai said, 2 great nations should deal with big issues. And the S&ED no longer deals with big issues. It deals with some, but it's gotten very bureaucratic and very detailed. I would like it to focus on a few key issues, not so much a checklist of issues.
Yi Hailin, this was, of course, the last strategic and economic dialogue co-hosted by the Obama administration. What's been the legacy, in your view, from the meetings that have been held over the past 8 years that President Obama has been in the White House?
I think for the last 8 years, China and the U.S. worked together to control their dispute. But just like our co-workers in U.S. mentioned, that it's these 2 big nations should focusing on the more broadly strategic agreements on the bilateral relationship, define the nature of this bilateral relationship. But unfortunately, for the last 8 years, basically they're focusing on some practical and pragmatic issues. So we, in China's perspective, maybe the next president, the next owner of the White House, probably will find a way to pave the way for these 2 nations can explore to define what's the nature of this bilateral relation, and focusing on more strategic and the big issue than only the pragmatic. So I think for the S&ED, it's opened a new gate and laid a very good foundation for the bilateral relation, but it's not enough. It needs to go higher and go deeper.
Sun Yun, what's your view? Is this forum serving the purpose that it was created for?
It was. But now there are a lot of disappointment associated with what S&ED is delivering and what S&ED is doing for this bilateral relationship. There are 2 sides of this conflict. So on one hand, people do argue that we need adult supervision. We need to push these issues higher, and we need the leaders on the top level to make a strategic decision about the nature of the U.S.-China relations. But on the other hand, the leaders don't have all the attention or the resources or even the time to focus on the details, every single details of this bilateral relationship. So they do need working level people. They do need the bureaucracies to work on these issues on the ground. But then the bureaucracy's intention or the tendency is to show that the dialogue is really working well, which is why we see more than 100 items every time coming out of S&ED on the agreements between the 2 sides. And a lot of the issues are really on the grassroots level, on tiny issues, and these are not really strategic issues. So how the next U.S. administration is going to address this intrinsic conflict between the need for adult supervision and the need for cooperation on the working level is absolutely a serious question.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Sun Yun, Robert Hormats, Yi Hailin, thanks to all of you for joining us. We need to take a short break right now. When we come back, we'll talk with the first Chinese American to serve as United States ambassador to China. Stay with us, you're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the just concluded China-U.S. strategic and economic dialogue. Joining us from Seattle, Washington is Gary Locke. During his distinguished career, he was elected the first state governor of Asian descent in the continental United States. He served as the first Chinese-American Secretary of Commerce and later became the first Chinese-American to represent the United States as ambassador to China. Ambassador, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, as we heard, the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry did raise the issue of the status of the South China Sea during this round of the strategic dialogue. China also had something to say on that. This is what the co-chair of the dialogue, Yang Jiechi, had to say. Let's watch.
The islands of the South China Sea belong to China since ancient times, and China is entitled to maintain its territorial sovereignty and right for maritime rights and interests.
So what did you make of those comments from the co-chair?
Well, those are long-standing positions of the Chinese government. Of course, that's disputed by many other countries in the area, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and so forth. And it's very, very important that neither side, none of the sides, take actions that can only dig in the heels of their respective sides, that they really try to solve this peacefully and diplomatically. The United States does not take a position on the ultimate sovereignty or the ownership of those islands, but we are concerned that China is taking actions, building military bases on these, which makes it very, very, very difficult to reach a diplomatic solution.
Okay, there are differences, but let's not forget that during this strategic dialogue, there was something like 300 cooperation initiatives that were reached during the two-day meeting. 120 of those were on foreign affairs. One of those concerned the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and both sides agreed that they would not recognize the DPRK as a nuclear power and that they would take action to make it difficult for the DPRK to initiate what they called further provocations. They also said that they were determined to impose sanctions on Pyongyang. That's a major step, isn't it?
Well, again, it shows that while we have disagreements with China on many issues, whether it's the actions that China is taking in the South China Sea, to cybersecurity or human rights, nonetheless, there are many, many areas of cooperation, scientific cooperation, medical research, climate change, trade, but also of security. And certainly North Korea is one of those areas of common interest and common effort. The United States and China have worked very well together in trying to force North Korea to stop its development of a nuclear weapon, and we're very pleased that China joined with the United States in going to the United Nations and seeking tougher sanctions on North Korea. Of course, North Korea very much listens to China, and so China is a critical player in trying to move North Korea from developing a nuclear weapon.
You know, one of the hallmarks of these meetings has been the fact that both sides have worked very hard to look at the mutual benefits that will come out of these meetings. You know, mutual benefits for their countries, for their people, for their workers. One of that is the financial sector. China says it will take steps to open up to more U.S. companies. That, of course, is going to be useful to both economies, isn't it?
Well, the more that China's economy opens up to foreign companies, not just the United States, it means that there are more companies providing different products and services. It's competition for the Chinese companies. So that always benefits the consumers. When you have companies vying for the attention, the purchasing power of consumers, that means companies have to innovate. They have to make sure that they're catering to the needs, the desires of the consumer, and that's ultimately good for the consumer. At the same time, we believe that more financial products, especially for the Chinese people, will encourage them to move away from just putting money under their mattress to having greater financial security, more investment opportunities, and better financial planning for their long-term future. So this also benefits the Chinese people in terms of the sectors that are being opened up, as well as foreign companies and especially American companies. And the more that American companies are able to compete, that's all we seek, is a level playing field. But the possibility of competition and competing, and if we're able to get more business, that means more jobs for the American people.
Right, on the issue of China's currency, this is an issue that's come up again and again. China said this time that it's committed to continue what it called market-oriented exchange rate reform that allows for two-way flexibility of the yuan. Explain to us why that's important.
Well, it's important that China's currency be stable, that the government is not manipulating the value of the currency. Now, the currency has fallen because of the weak world economy. Many currencies all across the world have fallen in relationship to the U.S. dollar. The U.S. economy is strong, and therefore the U.S. dollar is strong. It's just important that we let market forces really dictate the value and where the various foreign currencies settle out.
One of the big takeaways from this round of the strategic initiative was the agreements that came out on education. 158 cooperation initiatives. China's Vice Education Minister Hao Ping hopes that more exchange platforms, he said, could be established, which he said will benefit a new breed of China-U.S. relations. How important is this type of cooperation?
If we want more cooperation, whether it's in the business sector or in the government sector, in the military sector, there needs to be more understanding of each other's peoples, culture, history, language, customs, and ways of life. And that all begins with people-to-people relationships, people-to-people exchange, and certainly students. America welcomes foreign students. We have the best colleges and universities in the world, and that's why you have such a demand by foreign students to come here, because their parents very much value our method of education, critical thinking, analytical skills instead of just memorization, which is common in many colleges and universities in other parts of the world. It's also important for American students and American people to travel to China to understand the rich history, the culture, the language, and the customs. Former Prime Minister of Great Britain, Tony Blair, used to say that diplomacy, public diplomacy, government diplomacy, first begins with people-to-people. Certainly having more cooperation among our students is the critical first step.
Ambassador, this dialogue was established by the Obama administration. What is your assessment of how it's progressed so far, and how do you think it would continue under, say, a President Clinton or President Trump, the two candidates who appear will be fighting for the presidency here?
Well, the dialogue was actually started under President Bush, and it was really focused on economic issues. And under President Obama, it was expanded to include strategic or military issues, foreign policy issues, along with economic issues. So it has become a strategic and economic dialogue instead of essentially an economic dialogue. Certainly, U.S.-China relations are among the most important economically and politically in the world today. Our two countries are so interdependent economically, and the world is looking for leadership from both China and the United States to address so many of the issues facing the world, from climate change, terrorism, or reducing the threat of nuclear proliferation. And so U.S.-China relations has really matured and grown and improved all through the years since President Nixon first visited China. And it's been fairly consistent on an upward path, an improving path, despite Democratic and during Democratic and Republican administrations, despite Democrats and Republicans being in office. We hope that that will continue.
Ambassador Gary Locke, thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.